Hello everyone, welcome to our weekly series on the Indian Express Explained section. In this particular video discussion, we shall be taking up the important articles which have appeared in the Indian Express Explained section in the third week of March 2021. Let us begin our today's discussion. In this week's Explained section, we have a very important article related to the additional Tier 1 bonds. Now, before discussing as to what exactly are the additional Tier 1 bonds, let us first look into the background. I hope all of you must be aware about the S Bank crisis which took place in March 2020. Now, Yes Bank had raised almost around 8,000 crores worth money through the issuance of the additional Tier 1 bonds. But since the financial position of Yes Bank was quite poor, the RBI in March 2020 came up with a circular asking Yes Bank not to repay the investors of the 81 bonds, which means to say that whoever had invested in 81 bonds issued by Yes Bank did not get back their money. Now presently, the mutual fund companies in case of India have invested almost around 35,000 crores out of almost around 90,000 crores worth money raised by the banks through the 81 bonds. But as the previous experience has shown us, the investment in 81 bonds is considered to be quite risky. Accordingly, in March 2021, recently, SEBI came out with a notification. Through this particular notification, the SEBI sought to reduce the exposure of the mutual fund companies to the additional Tier 1 bonds. However, this particular notification issued by SEBI would make it difficult for the banks to raise capital through the issuance of the additional Tier 1 bonds. Accordingly, the Finance Ministry in case of India has asked SEBI to withdraw this recent notification. So as far as the UPSC prelims examination is concerned, you should basically understand as to what are the 81 bonds and how these bonds are different from the normal corporate bonds. Now this becomes quite important because as you can see in prelims 2016, we had a question related to the masala bonds which were in news in that particular year. Similarly, in prelims 2015, there was a question related to the Basel III norms which is closely related to the additional Tier 1 bonds. I hope all of you must be aware about the concept of the Basel III norms. Post the global financial crisis of the year 2007-8, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has come up with the Basel III norms which is required to be followed by all the banks across the world. Under the Basel III norms, the banks are required to maintain certain amount of capital in order to ensure higher resilience as well as a higher capability to withstand any kind of financial crisis in future. This capital which is required to maintain by the banks, it is expressed in terms of percentage of risk-weighted assets. According to Basel III norms laid down by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, it is at 10.5% of risk-weighted assets. Out of this 10.5%, the Tier 1 capital, which is to be raised through the issuance of shares, this is to be maintained at 6%, the Tier 2 capital at 2%, and the capital conservation buffer of 2.5%. The capital conservation buffer is basically the buffer capital which the banks are required to build up during good times, that is when they are earning profit, so that in future, if there is any kind of crisis, they should be able to withstand such kind of crisis. So overall, for the global banks, the capital which they are required to set aside is 10.5% of the risk-weighted assets. However, in case of India, in order to ensure the resilience of the Indian banking sector, the RBI has laid down stringent Basel III norms, wherein the capital requirement is 1% higher at 11.5% of the risk-weighted assets. As you can see here, according to Basel III norms, the Tier 1 capital is to be maintained at 6% for the global banks, but in case of India, the RBI has stipulated it to be at 7%. Out of this 7%, the common equity Tier 1 capital is at 5.5% and the additional Tier 1 capital is 1.5%. The remaining parameters are Tier 2 capital of 2%, which is similar to the Basel III norms, and the capital conservation buffer of 2.5%. So the total capital requirement for the Indian banks, which they are required to adopt, is 11.5% of the risk-weighted assets. Now, this common equity Tier 1 capital can be raised by the banks through the issuance of the shares. The Tier 2 capital can be raised by the banks through the issuance of debt or the bonds. As far as the additional Tier 1 capital is concerned, the banks can raise this particular capital through the issuance of specific type of bonds which are known as the additional Tier 1 bonds. So in simple words, the additional Tier 1 bonds are the bonds which are issued by the banks in order to meet their additional Tier 1 capital requirements under the Basel III norms. Now, these additional Tier 1 bonds which are issued by the banks, they are different from the normal bonds issued by the banks. This is so because the additional Tier 1 bonds are considered to be a hybrid instruments. That is, they have certain features of bonds as well as shares. So let us understand as to in what way the additional Tier 1 bonds are different from the normal corporate bonds. So when we look at the normal bonds issued by the banks, these normal bonds have a face value which denotes as to how much money the bank is borrowing. It has a rate of interest and a maturity period. However, in case of additional Tier 1 bonds, they have only the face value and the rate of interest. They do not have a maturity period. So in a way, the additional Tier 1 bonds are perpetual bonds. So when you invest in an additional Tier 1 bond issued by a particular bank, you would not be aware as to when would you get back your money. The normal bonds, they are considered to be secured because they are backed by a collateral, whereas additional Tier 1 bonds, they are considered to be unsecured because they are not backed by collateral. So obviously, since they are not backed by any kind of collateral, the investment in additional Tier 1 bonds are considered to be more risky in comparison to the normal bonds. So obviously in capital market, higher the risk, higher would be the rate of interest. So accordingly, the rate of interest on the additional Tier 1 bonds would be higher in comparison to the normal bonds. One specific feature of the additional Tier 1 bonds is that during certain circumstances, particularly when the bank's financial position is poor, the bank can skip the interest payments. However, when you invest in a normal bond, you are entitled to get the interest on a regular basis. It could be on a semi-annual basis or on a yearly basis. But when you invest in an additional Tier 1 bond, there could be certain years when the banks may not pay you the interest, particularly when its financial position is poor. Now, the Reserve Bank of India has come out with a detailed guidelines as to when the bank can skip the interest payments. Now, these detailed guidelines are not actually important from the perspective of the prelims examination. What you are required to know here is there is no obligation on the bank to pay the interest regularly to its investors. As far as the redemption of the normal bond is concerned, the normal bond would get redeemed upon the maturity period. So when the maturity period gets over, you as an investor, you would be entitled to get back your money. But as far as the additional Tier 1 bonds are concerned, as stated before, they are considered to be the perpetual bonds. Since they are perpetual bonds, the banks may continue to pay the interest until the time when the banks decides to repay the total principal amount. So the bank may decide to redeem the bond after just 1 year, or after 3 years, or after 10 years, or after 15 years. It is up to the bank when it wants to redeem the bond. But until the time it redeems the bond, the bank would have to continue to pay the interest. And more importantly, as stated before, whenever the bank's financial position is poor, the banks can skip the interest payments. As far as the investors are concerned, in case of bonds, that is the normal bonds, the investors can ask the particular company to return the money upon the maturity period. But since the additional Tier 1 bonds have no maturity period, the investors cannot ask for the return of their principal amount. The banks by themselves would decide as to when they would want to pay back their investors. More importantly, the RBI has come out with a detailed guidelines related to the issuance of the additional Tier 1 bonds. In particular, the RBI has come up with a clause which is known as point of non-viability event. Point of non-viability event basically means that a particular bank has become non-viable and it is not in a position to repay its investors who have invested in the additional Tier 1 bonds. Now, when such event occurs, the RBI can ask a particular bank not to repay the investors who have invested in the additional Tier 1 bonds. Now, this is what has happened in the S Bank crisis. The S Bank had reached the point of non-viability event, and accordingly, the RBI asked the S Bank not to repay the money to the investors who had invested in the additional Tier 1 bonds. So obviously, looking at these features, you would have got to know that investment in additional Tier 1 bonds is considered to be more risky in comparison to the normal bonds. But the question is, why do the investors still invest in the additional Tier 1 bonds? One obvious feature is these bonds carry higher rate of interest in comparison to normal bonds. So those risk-taking investors who would want to make quick money out of their investment, they would be interested to make investment in the additional Tier 1 bonds. So let's understand as to what is the recent controversy which has arisen over the SEBI's notification. Presently, the mutual fund companies have invested almost around 35,000 crores in the additional Tier 1 bonds. But as seen in the S Bank crisis, if these banks are not in a position to repay back the money, or if they reach the point of non-viability event, then the RBI can write down the additional Tier 1 bonds. This can cause a huge loss to the investors who have invested the money in the mutual funds. Now, presently, when the mutual fund companies invest their money in the additional Tier 1 bonds, they are required to carry out a valuation of the additional Tier 1 bonds. That is what is the present value of the additional Tier 1 bonds. And that valuation is done as per the expected redemption date of the additional Tier 1 bond. Now, for example, a particular mutual fund company may believe that ICICI Bank may redeem the additional Tier 1 bond issued by it after 5 to 7 years. Similarly, it may believe that if the HDFC Bank had issued the additional Tier 1 bond, the mutual fund company which had bought this additional Tier 1 bond may expect that the HDFC Bank may redeem this particular bond after say 3 to 5 years. Now, this is an assumption or an expected redemption date which is taken into account by the mutual fund companies for valuing the additional Tier 1 bonds. Now, for example, if the HDFC Bank does not redeem the bond after 3 to 5 years, accordingly, they will come up with a new expected redemption date. Now, what is important to be noted here is that a particular mutual fund company may expect the redemption date to be after say 3 to 5 years, but the bank may not redeem the bond upon this 3 to 5 year period. So there is a lot of risk involved in the investment in the additional Tier 1 bonds. Hence, SEBI has come up with a detailed notification. Predominantly, it has focused on two important clauses. According to the first clause, from April 1st, 2021, the mutual fund companies would be required to treat the additional Tier 1 bonds as the bonds with a maturity period of 100 years. So earlier, the mutual fund companies used to carry out a valuation of the additional Tier 1 bonds as per the expected redemption date. But now, they would be required to carry out the valuation based upon the maturity period of 100 years. But this is in no way means that the maturity period of the additional Tier 1 bonds has been changed to 100 years. This is done only for the purpose of accounting. So all the additional Tier 1 bonds are required to be treated as the bonds with a maturity period of 100 years, even though a bank may return back the invested money after say only 5 to 7 years. Now, this is a accounting exercise which is required to be carried out by mutual fund companies when they invest their money in the additional tier 1 bonds. More importantly, in order to reduce the exposure of the mutual fund companies to the additional tier 1 bonds, the SEBI has laid down that a particular mutual fund scheme should not invest more than 10% of its funds in the additional tier 1 bonds. Obviously, the rationale behind the SEBI notification is to reduce the exposure of the mutual fund companies to the additional tier 1 bonds and to protect the investors who would invest their money in the additional tier 1 bonds indirectly through the mutual fund companies. However, this recent notification by SEBI has been opposed by the Finance Ministry. And why is that? First and foremost, if the mutual fund companies start treating the additional tier 1 bonds with a maturity period of 100 years. So earlier, the mutual fund companies used to treat the additional tier 1 bonds as per the expected redemption date, but now they would be required to treat the additional tier 1 bonds as a bonds with a maturity period of 100 years. So obviously, they would be considered to be more risky. So more number of mutual fund companies would now sell off the additional tier 1 bonds, and there would be less demand for the additional tier 1 bonds in the Indian financial market. Secondly, if the mutual fund companies reduce their exposure to the additional tier 1 bonds to below 10% of the total funds, this would in turn make it difficult for the banks to raise capital in order to comply with the Basel III norms. On account of these two reasons, the Finance Ministry has asked SEBI to dilute its notification related to the additional tier 1 bonds. See, as far as this recent controversy which has arisen over the SEBI's notification is concerned, it does not become important from the perspective of the UPSC prelims examination. UPSC would not go into these technical aspects related to the SEBI's notification, but the UPSC could probably ask a question related to the additional tier 1 bonds. So as far as the UPSC prelims is concerned, you should basically understand that the additional tier 1 bonds are perpetual and non-secured debt instruments issued by the banks in order to meet their additional tier 1 requirements under the Basel III norms. The next article is India's push for the electric vehicles. In this week's explained section, we had an article which highlighted about the Delhi government's ambitious plan to switch to electric vehicles. In August 2020, that is last year, the Delhi government had come up with the electric vehicles policy. The objective of this particular policy is to ensure that by end of 2024, at least 25% of the vehicles registered in Delhi, they should be electric vehicles. See, as far as the UPSC is concerned, UPSC is unlikely to ask questions related to the state specifics or the policies. UPSC is more likely to ask questions related to the national schemes and the national policies in order to promote electric mobility in India. So, in the UPSC prelims, we could get questions related to the various initiatives to promote electric vehicles, such as the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan 2020, the FAME scheme, the National Council for Electric Mobility, the National Board for the Electric Mobility. And as far as the mains exam is concerned, in mains examination, UPSC could ask a question related to the prospects, challenges, and the strategies that are needed in order to promote electric mobility in India. For example, a mains question for the practice could be the government's policy to push the electric mobility should be tailor-made to suit our unique mobility pattern and must seek to address various bottlenecks. Justify by giving logical arguments in support of your answer. So if you have to write the answer to this particular question, you should basically know about what the FAME scheme basically does, what are the problems in the FAME scheme, and how these problems have to be addressed, in particular, in order to suit our unique mobility pattern. See, the various aspects of the electric mobility in case of India I have already discussed in much greater detail in our DNS dated 9th of August 2020. As you can see here, in this particular DNS, I have discussed the various facets of electric mobility, such as why should India give a push for the electric mobility, what initiatives the government has taken, and what are the present constraints and challenges. Now, for example, it is being said that if we adopt the electric mobility, then the energy demand in case of India can reduce by almost around 64%. Similarly, we can reduce our carbon emissions by 37%. Both these things are possible by the end of 2030 if we adopt the electric mobility. This is as per a study which was carried out by Niti Aayog. Accordingly, the government has taken a number of initiatives such as the National Electric Mobility Mission Plan, the FAME scheme, the National Council for Electric Mobility, the National Board for Electric Mobility, and so on. Now, in spite of these initiatives taken by the government, even today, the adoption of electric mobility is saddled with multifaceted challenges. So, all of these challenges related to the promotion of electric mobility have already discussed in the DNS dated 9th of August 2020. So, since this particular topic has been discussed holistically already in our DNS, we will not be covering this particular article once again in the explained section for the Indian Express. Nevertheless, what we would do here is we will take up certain practice questions from this particular topic so as to enable you to prepare for the upcoming prelims examination. So we have two practice questions in front of us. Let us take the first practice question related to the FAME scheme. The FAME scheme provides for a demand incentive to the consumers in the form of upfront reduced purchase price of the electric vehicles. See, when you want to buy an electric vehicle, the electric vehicles are usually costly, and this can act as a prohibitive factor for the adoption of the electric vehicles in India. So, in order to encourage the people to buy the electric vehicles, the government provides for a demand incentive in the form of upfront reduced purchase price. Now, for example, let's say the cost of a particular electric vehicle is 1.5 lakh. Now, the government may decide to reduce the price of this electric vehicle by certain X amount. Now, this X amount in this particular case may be say around rupees 20,000. So, when you purchase this electric vehicle, you would not be required to pay the entire 1.5 lakh rupees. Instead, you would be required to pay only 1.3 lakh rupees. The remaining 20,000 rupees would be paid on behalf of you to the concerned manufacturer by the government of India. So this rupees 20,000 is a form of incentive. Now this kind of demand incentive is applicable on all kinds of electric vehicles, which includes both private vehicles as well as the public transportation vehicles. But the way the FAME scheme is designed, higher incentives are provided for the public vehicles. More importantly, the incentive provided under the FAME scheme also depends upon the battery capacity. So, higher the battery capacity of an electric vehicle, higher would be the demand incentive given by the government of India. This is once again done in order to ensure that adequate amount of research and development takes place in order to come out with batteries with the higher capacities. So, if you look at the first statement here, the first statement as we discussed is obviously correct. The second statement says it provides incentives only for the public transport and commercial vehicles. As I've discussed, this statement here is wrong because it provides incentives even for the private vehicles. The third statement is this scheme is implemented by Niti Aayog. Even this statement here is wrong. This is so because this particular scheme is implemented by the Ministry of Heavy Industries and Public Enterprises. So, the right answer to this particular question is A, that is one only. Coming to the second question, consider the following statements related to the National Council of Electric Mobility. It has been established in accordance with the National Mission for Electric Mobility. This statement here is correct. The second statement is it is headed by the Prime Minister to approve the final policies related to the adoption of the electric vehicles. Now, even though it approves the final policies related to the adoption of electric vehicles, it is not headed by Prime Minister, rather Minister for Heavy Industries. So, the right answer to this particular question would be A, that is one only. Now what you can do is you can go through this particular DNS dated 9th of August 2020. Now after going through this particular DNS, you can try writing answer to this particular mains question for practice. With this, let us now take up the next article. The next article is related to the recently passed Farm Acts. I hope all of you must be aware, recently the Parliament of India has passed the 3 Farm Acts in order to liberalize the agriculture marketing regime and to give the necessary freedom to the farmers to sell their agriculture produce wherever and whomsoever they would want to. Now recently, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Food, Consumer Affairs and Public Distribution has called upon the government to implement the amendments to the Essential Commodities Act in both letter as well as spirit. The Parliamentary Standing Committee believes that implementing the amendments to the Essential Commodities Act would not only benefit the farmers in terms of increase in the income level, but it will also incentivize various stakeholders to invest in storage as well as cold chain infrastructure. See, as far as the UPSC prelims examination is concerned, since the recently passed Farm Acts have created a lot of controversy, one must be aware about the salient features of these 3 Farm Acts. As far as the mains examination is concerned, you should be aware about the critical analysis of the 3 Farm Acts. That is, in what way these Farm Acts would benefit the farmers and what are the problems with respect to these 3 Farm Acts. We could get a question, that is, do you think the government's long pending agriculture marketing reforms introduced as part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat package is a 1991 movement for the Indian agriculture? Give arguments in support of your answer. So if you have to write the answer to this particular question, you should know the benefits of these 3 Farm Acts, the challenges with these 3 Farm Acts, and in your conclusion, you should be writing the strategies to address these challenges. Now, when these 3 Farm Acts were passed and had created a lot of controversy, we have discussed in detail all of these 3 Farm Acts in a separate video. So we had released a separate video wherein we had carried out a detailed analysis of these 3 Farm Acts. As you can see, we have carried out the pros, cons and the strategies which are required in order to address the challenges with respect to the first Farm Act. We have done the same thing with respect to the second Farm Act, which seeks to regulate the contract farming in India. We had also discussed the same with respect to the amendments to the Essential Commodities Act. See, the Essential Commodities Act was first enacted in the year 1955 in order to protect the consumers from undue increase in the prices of certain essential commodities. Under the Essential Commodities Act, the central government has been empowered to regulate the production, supply and distribution of certain commodities which are declared as the essential commodities. Some of the commodities which are presently covered under this particular act include drugs, fertilizers, petroleum products, etc. So the central government keeps on monitoring the prices of certain commodities. If there is a sudden and drastic increase in the prices of these commodities, automatically such a commodity would be placed under schedule of the Essential Commodities Act. So it is the central government that takes a decision to place a commodity under the Essential Commodities Act, and such a decision of the central government is taken based upon the consultation with the state government. So once a commodity is placed under the Essential Commodities Act, the central government can then impose stock holding restrictions. So if anyone is involved in black marketing or hoarding of certain essential commodities, such a person can get convicted under the Essential Commodities Act. Now it is being said that this Essential Commodities Act has gone against the interest of the Indian agriculture. This is so because, let's say, there is a bumper harvest of the agricultural produce in a particular year. Ideally, when such bumper harvest takes place, various stakeholders such as the traders, the food processing industries, etc., they should buy in bulk from the farmers. But these stakeholders always have an apprehension that the government may impose the stock holding restrictions on the agricultural commodities. So this kind of apprehension by the traders and the food processing industries in turn lead to lower procurement of the agricultural commodities from the farmers. So we have a typical scenario wherein, in spite of the bumper harvest of the agricultural commodities, the farmers may not get fair and remunerative prices. This is predominantly because the traders in the food processing industries are reluctant to purchase agricultural commodities in bulk because they feel that in future the government may impose stock holding restrictions. Similarly, the flexibility which the government has got to impose the stock holding restrictions has also reduced the incentive of the food processing industries to invest in the storage houses, that is the godowns, and the cold chain infrastructure. So this in turn has led to huge amount of post-harvest losses. Hence, in order to address these problems, the Parliament has decided to amend the Essential Commodities Act. Under this particular amendment, the Parliament has stated that under normal circumstances, the agricultural commodities would not be brought under the purview of the Essential Commodities Act. Stockholding limit on the agricultural commodities would be imposed only under exceptional circumstances. So under normal circumstances, no stockholding limit would be imposed, but under exceptional circumstances such as exponential price rise, famine, drought, etc., the government has the flexibility to impose the stockholding restrictions. Now, the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Food, Consumer Affairs and Public Distribution has called upon the government to implement this particular amendment to the Essential Commodities Act in both letter as well as spirit. Since all of these aspects have already been covered in much greater detail, I will not be covering these aspects once again. Nevertheless, we will discuss certain prelims-based questions in order to help you prepare for the upcoming prelims examination. Coming to the first question, the question here is, with reference to the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Act 2020, consider the following statements. This act seeks to abolish the APMCs set up by the states and give the freedom to the farmers to sell their agricultural produce anywhere within India. See, this particular act does not seek to abolish the APMCs. Rather, it seeks to create a parallel marketing structure along with the APMCs. Hence, the first statement here is wrong. Whereas, statement number 2 and statement number 3 are correct. Accordingly, the right answer is C. Coming to the second question, with reference to the Essential Commodities Act, consider the following statements. Both the central government and the state government may add or remove a commodity from the purview of the Essential Commodities Act. As I discussed before, only the central government has been empowered to add or remove a commodity from the Essential Commodities Act, and such a decision of the central government is taken based upon the consultation of the state government. So state government on their own, they cannot add or remove a commodity from the purview of the Essential Commodities Act. Hence, this statement here is wrong. Secondly, presently the agricultural commodities are completely outside the purview of the Essential Commodities Act. As I said, they are not completely under the purview of the Essential Commodities Act. Even today, the government can impose stockholding restrictions under certain circumstances. Hence, the right answer to this particular question should be D, neither 1 nor 2. Now, the next article is related to the anti-defection law. This particular article basically discusses the grounds on which a nominated MP from the Rajya Sabha can lose the membership of the House under the anti-defection law. So before understanding the context of this particular article, let us first understand the important provisions of the anti-defection law. Originally, the Indian Constitution did not provide for the anti-defection. The anti-defection was introduced in the Indian Constitution through the 52nd Amendment. It was introduced as part of the 10th schedule to the Indian Constitution. The idea behind introduction of the anti-defection was to provide for the disqualification of the members of the parliament as well as the state legislatures when they defect from one political party to another. So the idea behind the introduction of the anti-defection was to promote parliamentary ethics and to prevent the switching over of the members of the parliament from one political party to another. The presiding officer of the House is considered to be the final authority to decide on the anti-defection of the members. So in case of the Lok Sabha, it would be Lok Sabha Speaker. In case of Rajya Sabha, it shall be the chairman of the Rajya Sabha. Now the grounds on which the members can be disqualified are multiple. First and foremost, if a member voluntarily gives up the membership of the political party, or if a political party issues a whip, and if a member votes or abstains from voting contrary to the whip issued by the political party without taking the prior permission. In that case, a member can get disqualified. Similarly, if an independent candidate joins any political party, even then such a member can get disqualified. As far as a nominated member is concerned, I hope you must be aware that in case of Rajya Sabha, it provides for 12 nominated members who can be from the fields of science, literature, art, social service, etc. These members are nominated by the President, obviously based upon the recommendations of the Council of Ministers. So if these nominated candidates joins any political party after 6 months, then they would get disqualified. So one thing you must understand here is that if a nominated candidate joins any political party within 6 months of his nomination, then he will not be disqualified. But if he joins any political party after 6 months, then he stands to get disqualified. As far as the independent candidate is concerned, there is no time limit on the independent candidate. Irrespective whether he joins after 1 day or after 6 months, an independent candidate, if he joins any political party, he always stands to get disqualified under the anti-defection law. Now this particular article basically highlights that a nominated MP from Rajya Sabha, Mr. Swapan Das Gupta, he is contesting the elections in West Bengal on a ticket which has been issued by BJP. So the BJP political party has issued ticket to this nominated MP in order to contest the elections in the West Bengal. Now Mr. Swapan Das Gupta got nominated to the Rajya Sabha in the year 2016. So within first 6 months, he did not join the political party. But now, he is contesting on a BJP ticket for the upcoming West Bengal elections. So if he is contesting elections on a ticket which is issued by a political party, it is as good as saying that he has joined a political party, because of which he stood to be disqualified. So even before he was disqualified from being a member of the Rajya Sabha, Mr. Swapan Das Gupta has decided to tender his resignation from the Rajya Sabha. Now there are certain exceptions to the anti-defection law. First and foremost, if 2/3 of the members of a political party join with any other political party, then these 2/3 of the members would not get disqualified. And secondly, the Speaker of the House may decide to give up the membership of the political party. Such a provision has been included in order to ensure the sanctity and non-partisan role of the Speaker of the House. So based upon our discussion, let us take up two practice questions. The first question here is, under which among the following scenarios can the members of the parliament be disqualified under the anti-defection law? The first one is when a member of a political party A is actively campaigning in the favor of political party B without voluntarily resigning from party A. Now, if you look at the anti-defection law, it says that a member stands to be disqualified if he voluntarily resigns from a political party. However, but how do you know that a particular person has voluntarily resigned from a particular political party? Now, Supreme Court has given a number of examples as to what would constitute voluntarily giving up the membership of a political party. Now, for example, if a member is actively campaigning in favor of another political party, or if a particular member is actively speaking openly against a political party, all such circumstances can be construed that a person has given up the membership of the political party and has joined other political party. The second one is when an independent member joins political party after 6 months. Now, as discussed before, an independent member, if he joins political party irrespective of the time period, he or she stands to be disqualified. So even the second scenario is also correct. The third one says when a nominated member joins political party after 6 months, this is also correct. So the right answer would be 1, 2 and 3. With respect to nominated members of the Rajya Sabha, consider the following statements. These members are not entitled to vote in the election of the President and the Vice President. These members are exempted from filing their assets and liabilities under the Representation of People's Act 1951. I would want you to find out the answer to this particular question and respond in the comment section below. The next article is related to the recent tussle between the elected government of Delhi and the Lieutenant Governor. See, recently the Union government had introduced the National Capital Territory of Delhi Amendment Bill 2021 before the Indian Parliament. This particular bill seeks to amend the National Capital Territory of Delhi Act 1991. This basically seeks to provide for a framework of the functioning of the Legislative Assembly of Delhi. More importantly, this particular bill seeks to amend certain powers and responsibilities of the Legislative Assembly of Delhi and the Lieutenant Governor. Now, the salient features of this particular bill, as well as what problems could probably arise once this particular bill is implemented, all of these aspects have already been covered by us in our DNS dated 20th of March 2021. Since these topics have been covered already, we would not be covering these aspects once again. So you can go through the DNS dated 20th of March 2021 to know the salient features of the National Capital Territory of Delhi Amendment Bill 2021 and what implications it would have on the functioning of the Delhi government.